should go short, but so you can get some other examples if you want to practice more and more of, okay, what are some other graphs that I might throw at you and everything. Biggest portion of this quiz will be, do you know about inverse functions? Do you know how they look in their tables? Or how do you know by their graph that they should be a reflection across the y equals x line? I really expect you to know about the table. You should know the inputs and outputs switch with inverse functions. Knowing how by a graph we change the asymptotes from an exponential to a logarithmic function switch. It's no longer y equals, it's now x equals a number. Domain is no longer all real numbers. Domain is restricted by our asymptote. Range now becomes all real numbers. Practicing finding the inverse. We talked about 2 rules yesterday, or 2 steps. First step is to switch x and y. And then along the way, we need to rewrite at some point. So this will also practice, okay, do you know how to rewrite an expression? In order to rewrite this log, I got to figure out the base. To rewrite, I'm going to use this base e to the power x is equal to the argument y plus 2. Because this quiz is going to be a snowball effect, this is actually what I want you to do. This is problem 2 on your quiz. You're going to have to find an inverse, and we're going to use this inverse to compute your table for problem 3. Let's try this one more time. Can you find the inverse of this function? We're going to rewrite. Since I can't add, subtract, multiply, or divide by anything to get y by itself, let's try to change that 49 to be a base of 7 to a power. And we know that's going to be 49 can be rewritten as 7 squared to the x power. I've got a power raised to a power, so here's where those exponential rules from 8.1 and 2 come in handy. If I've got a power raised to a power, it becomes 2y. So from previous homework, we've seen that if you have the same base, we can zoom in on those exponents and say x has to equal 2y in order for this expression to be true. Now I can get y by itself, very simply, by dividing both sides by 2. I'm going to give you this function, and we're going to attack it like I want you to attack it on the quiz. The goal of tomorrow will be, hey, can you graph this function? But we're going to do directions to problem 3 first. No, we're going to do directions to problem 2. So we're going to find the inverse of this first. And then we will create a table for the inverse. And then the last thing we'll do is graph the logarithmic function. We're going to take that inverse and create a table. So we're going to have our regular inputs, -3, -2, -1, 0, 1, 2, 3, and we're going to plug those into that exponential function. This is what I get from my outputs. Problem 4 says, you've got to think about inverses and input and output tables. We found the inverse function to this entire thing. Yesterday we talked about how, okay, we can take this in bits and pieces, but if we found the complete inverse of all of that and switch the inputs and outputs, we will have the graph of our function. I'm going to give you some time. Switch those inputs and outputs and graph them. See what it looks like. That is your problem 4. I'm going to take all this writing away and show you the ending output table, input-output table of this. So we did not go over these at inputs and outputs, but our table should start here on down. The graph looks like the following. Inputs are approaching an asymptote. See if you can determine what that asymptote is. That's the next thing that's going to pop up, because we're going to state the domain and range, the ending to our problem 4. State the asymptote. We're going to create a domain using that asymptote. And then the range. And then range, in this case, any real number. Any real number. We switch the inputs and outputs, and then we go to graphing. That's the problem 4 on your quiz. Because our inputs are getting closer and closer to -5, that's going to become our asymptote when I see this graph. Asymptote is -5. Our domain is based around that asymptote. And since it's to the right, that's why we have x is greater than -5. Range is all real numbers.